So in this tutorial video, I want to show you a quick and easy method of painting these planters. The model itself is a 3D print, and I've modified it to hollow or to be hollow and to have an insert for a magnet that's 5x3. I'll make sure to have a link to the file that you can download in the video description below. And really, we're just going to be focusing on a quick and easy dry brush method, along with some line work to bring out the wood grain detail, to really get these painted quickly and looking effective on the tabletop. We're going to do two different versions. We're going to do one with sort of just basic shrubbery, and we're going to be using Woodland Scenics for this. And then I'll do another one using some tufts to do more of a flower bed, so something more along the lines of something you'd find in a garden. So to paint the wood grain on the planters, I'm going to be using a dry brushing technique, working through a number of browns and ochres. I'm going to start with a base coat of Vallejo's Burnt Umber, which I just apply very liberally with a big dry brush. And then I start to dry brush my way through English uniform and Japanese uniform World War II for my first few highlights. I want to make sure that I pull my dry brush in the direction that I want the wood grain to be traveling. My next couple of highlights, using Germo Camo Orange Ochre, and then AK's Decomposed Flesh, I apply in a sort of stippling motion to try and incorporate some textural work and some sort of grain to the wood that isn't just strokes along the path of the wood grain. I'm going to go in with some pure decomposed flesh and apply some edge highlights to the top raised lips of each of the planks of wood, as well as on the top, before going in with some Games Workshop's contrast snakebite leather to paint the wood grain lines on each of the sides. With the wood grain done, I'm now going to go take some masking tape and I'm going to mask off all of the wooden elements so that we can use our quick and dirty dry brushing stippling technique on the borders and the frames. Now, if you don't want to spend the time masking and you just want to hand paint the borders, that's perfectly fine as well. I just find that doing this allows me to be a little bit more textural and messy with the edges without having to worry about overpainting into any of the wooden elements. Doing this is much trickier and more time-consuming by hand with any sort of accuracy without having to mask the wood. So it's entirely your call whether you want to do this stuff or not. I just like to put on a show or a film, and I spend a bit of time, I zen out, and the masking just means that I keep the entire process nice and loose and fairly straightforward and brain dead, if I'm being honest. Once I have all the masking tape in place, I'm going to paint the metal using 4 colors. I'm going to begin with a base coat of AK Ash Gray, just apply with my basic dry brush over the entire thing, and then I'm going to dry brush progressively through graphite and medium sea gray. As I use my sort of stipple method, I'm going to go higher and higher up, leaving more of the undercoat showing, and essentially just sort of creating a faux fade with a bit of a worn metal texture look on the surface. Once I've dry brushed and stippled those 3 colors, I'm going to go in with some tweezers and some pluck foam, and using AK Pale Gray, I'm going to apply some stipple sponge weathering, focusing on the edges on top and then particularly on the bottom, because I want these planters to be movable objects, so I imagine they're going to see wear and tear on the bottom as well, and being moved around and slid on the ground. Once I've painted all of the metal elements, I can go ahead and remove all of the masking tape. I'm going to finish up the paint work on the planters with some enamels. I'm going to be using AK's panel liner for this. This is the green and brown armor. I'm sorry, the label is worn off. Essentially, this is like an oil paint diluted right out of the bottle, and it's a little more translucent than oils. You really can't control the saturation of this, like the intensity. You can dilute it more with mineral spirits to drop it down, but you can't increase the strength. So something to be aware of if you are going to invest in these products is that they aren't as flexible as oils, despite them being much more convenient. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and essentially I'm going to do some panel lining in between the armor and the wood. And because we're treating this like an oil paint, we have to use a separate brush it should be synthetic for this. And then we're going to need to dilute and clean with mineral spirits or some other thinner you would use for oils, not water, and definitely not a sable brush. You can just use a little bit of capillary action to help the paint pull down if it isn't all the way through. You just need to load the brush a little bit. And we can let gravity do the work. The enamel also, if you get it into the wood paneling, help to crease and just add a little bit more depth to the panel lining in between. And then because we can treat it like an oil, we can go in with mineral spirits and we can clean up any mess, any overpaints. Even once the enamel has dried, it's got a reactivation working time I found of about 1 to 2 days. So it's pretty forgiving in the sense that we can go back in and we can reactivate, clean up, push around the material without any real issue. So once we've done the painting, we're going to be applying a bit of earth texture. So you can see in this finished one how there's that brownness on the inside. And that's not just sort of brown paint, although you could get away with just putting some brown paint or whatever and then doing the foliage on top. But I like having a bit of that texture in there. And for this, I'm going to be using AK's Dark Earth. So on 2 of these, I'm just going to be doing the Woodland Scenics foliage as so. All we're going to do is we're going to take our Dark Earth product and we're just going to apply it right into the planter. Don't be afraid to be a little liberal with it. We really don't want to focus on the edges, on the outside here, because the inside will get covered with the foliage. Now this will take a couple hours to dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to, because we built it up fairly thickly, set this aside to dry overnight. We're going to give this about 12 hours. Give it time to fully set. And then once it does, we can come back and we can glue in our foliage. And that'll complete the more bush-like of the planters, how else to describe it. So like this. Now, for the other 2, I want to have flowers and not just grass foliage or bush foliage in the planters. And we're going to be using some floral tufts for this. Now, the ones that I'm using, they're not the right scale for marble in terms of like the labeling, but I think because it does come in a shallower size, these work very, very well. Now, if you're using normal tufts that are flat on the bottom and just like your regular tufts, you can probably do this in 2 phases. So do the soil and the earth as normal, let the earth dry, and then glue in your tufts with white glue or super glue. This particular brand, I didn't realize this when I bought it, has a bit of a plastic film on the bottom that is from the adhesive that they used for the static grass and for the tufts. So I can't just glue this on top of the soil because this plastic thing will show through. So what I'm actually going to do is, while this earth texture is still wet, I'm just going to seat the tufts in there. And I'm going to use the depth of the planter to my advantage to basically just hide that plastic adhesive. And then this texture paste, once it dries, essentially acts as my glue to hold the tufts in place. And once those tufts are in place, again, as before, we can set this aside to dry. We'll leave it overnight for, again, the 12 hours because I've applied it fairly thickly on the bottom. It may take a little longer, I don't know, but because there's something else we have to do to this, we'll just set it aside until it's fully dry, and then we can varnish it, and this planter is complete. So once the planter's the mud effects are dry, and you can test this by just poking it, it'll be solid to the touch. If there's any sort of give or it feels squishy, then it hasn't fully cured underneath, and you want to give it a little more time to dry. Once it's fully dry and set, we're ready to then move on to the final step of gluing in the clump foliage. Now, this is specifically sold by Woodland Scenics. I'm not sure if there are other brands, but I like using Woodland Scenics. Specifically, their clump foliage. You don't want to buy their turf foliage or like any sort of their scatter. You want specifically the ones that are sort of in big pieces and chunks, like the aforementioned clumps, and that'll allow you to more easily glue on large pieces of it without any issue. Now, I have two colors here. I have light green and medium green. And so medium green is sort of this mid dark tone green, and then light green is a little bit more on the earthy camo side. I like using both, having a bit of variety on the board. I have a lot of smaller planters, these little square ones where I do a 50-50 split. And so what I'm going to do on these two is I'm going to also do a 50-50 split. So I'll do one in the light green and one in the dark green. I have this in a container, just makes it easy for me to grab and access, and I'm not fishing into the bag. It can be a little messy, so once you've cut the bag open, I do recommend using a Ziploc bag or a freezer bag or a Tupperware container to store it, and that'll make it less of a mess to use. To secure it to the base, I'm going to be using some carpenter's glue, a little bit more durable than white glue or Mod Podge, I find, but you can use those depending on how handily or how often your train gets handled and how it gets handled. So we're going to start with putting a big glop of carpenter's glue over the surface. And I'm going to focus on the center because the clump foliage isn't going to be perfectly flat. It's going to be a little bit rounded. And so when we apply it, especially on the edges, it's going to have an undercut, and you don't want any of this carpenter glue showing through. So I'm going to fish through, and I'm going to find a couple of big clumps that I can glue down. Nice ones without any sort of that stringiness to it. So I'll start with this one, and I'll just press it down. And then for this one, I'm going to add a bit of white glue to the side here so that the two clumps will stick together. And press it down together. Now there's a little bit of a gap here, so I'm going to get some of these smaller clumps, and I'm just going to ram jam them in there. And then there's still some glue showing on top. So I'll get some of the smaller pieces. And then it's all just about filling the space. As you're applying the clump foliage, you're going to find little gaps, little openings. And I like to have a nice sort of rounded shape and evenly manicured all the way around. So all I'm going to do now is just slowly add bits and pieces to fill out the planter until the clump foliage basically inhabits a nice space and shape that I'm happy with. And then once you're done gluing all your foliage down, just give it a nice press. Make sure that it's firmly seated at the base of the planter and that the glue is being mashed into the sort of porous air pockets within the clump. And then we set that aside to dry. This stuff takes a couple hours to fully set, so you don't want to be handling it until then. So yeah, this wood glue, again, it says it'll cure and clamp within 25 minutes, but I have found that for maximal strength, you do want to let it set for, I would say, 5 to 6 hours. So we're going to set that aside to dry, and then we'll just do the same thing for the black green. Now, one thing I do like about having both colors mixed into one container as well, with some of the smaller pieces, you do get a bit of a blend in there. And depending on whether you want a bit more of a natural look or not, that sort of natural mixing can create a little bit more of a more natural looking combination of the two. So you get little splashes of that camel green and the dark green color and vice versa. And I believe Woodland Scenics has a larger variety of colors. It's not just the light green and the dark green. They've got a whole bunch or a whole range of turf and clump foliage colors. So I highly recommend browsing their site, picking a little bunch. You can never have enough foliage and turf from them. And they're not terribly expensive. So if you do end up doing a lot of terrain, it's nice to have all that sort of in your toolbox and ready to go. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. And I hope it teaches you some pretty quick and simple techniques that you can apply to your own terrain painting, whether it's working on these planters specifically or elements that are similar. When you're making these planters, whether you're using the STL files or you're scratch building them yourselves, I think it's a great way to add a combination of man-made and organic elements to an urban environment and add a lot more life to your tabletop games. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like, and you can subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to follow my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to drop links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.